Let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, I kept the talk kind of shorter than maybe previous ones, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. I don't know how many of you are here because of the lecture series, how many of you are here because you saw the message of the day. So the title of this talk has changed a little bit. It was originally going to be "We're Not All Green," and there's an important sort of message embedded in that kind of came out when we were talking about ecofeminism and some of the difficulties that exist in sort of the intersections of different sort of justice movements, right? And I kind of wanted to change the focus, at least in the title of this piece, because my dissertation advisor is writing a book right now on racialized conscious, and he and I stay in touch, and he did a keynote at a conference I was at this past weekend, and I was really kind of interested in the way he was approaching the problem, and it really kind of, I think, meshed well with what I'm trying to do here. So I kind of took a sidestep around the original idea. So we're going to talk about new white supremacy and old environmental racism. And so I want to kind of approach the problem of racism so that we're all sort of thinking about this in the same way. Then I want to apply it to environmental justice issues to kind of talk about how we might rethink what environmental justice ought to look like if we intend to take justice seriously. Okay, so that's where we're at. So in a similar vein as our previous discussions, I would like to argue that at the point of intersectionality, we are not all green. That is, by using the activism inherent in environmental activism, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that not all communities are similarly affected by environmental problems, nor are all communities similarly situated to prevent environmental harms being done to those communities. So when we talk about being environmentally aware, it's incumbent upon us to ensure that our awareness is not only sensitive to the travails of minority communities, but that we also simultaneously realize that by arguing for environmental justice, we are not always arguing for real justice. That is, an equitable distribution of justice. As such, we need to address not only what environmental racism is, that is, what it looks like in its various forms, but we must also address the root of the problem itself, the racism inherent in white supremacy. So let's start with racism. The most basic form of racism, the overt kind, the racist token that everyone who is quick to declaim they're not a racist is sure to recognize immediately. Right? Overt racism is generally defined as intentional or obviously harmful attitudes or behaviors directly or indirectly aimed at a minority individual or group because of their skin color. That's a pretty standard definition of race. I would be shocked that anyone went, oh my gosh, I just learned something, right? Here's the thing though, right? People who tend to speak out against racism are usually not wrong about what they have identified as racism, because it's usually the overt kind that we're most aware of. And certainly racist behavior should be identified and rectified, right? Overt racism is usually of the type that everyone attempting to avoid appearing to be a racist can steer clear of with respect to all racial issues. Like, you know not to tell racist jokes. You know to avoid racist stereotypes. I'm just going to assume that that's true, right? Somebody in here is like, oh no, what am I doing with my life? I don't know, right? So that's sort of the thing with overt racism. Okay? The rectification of racism, when directed at overt usages of racist tropes, allows us too often to overlook or fail to account for our own racism. To state it bluntly, the truth of what it means to be an American is that being a white American is tantamount to being a racist. Sorry, guys. All right, me included. That is, being born into this culture throws you into the role of a racist. And these arguments, in many ways, could easily be extended to other Western or European countries, especially those that have a similar cultural model to the United States. Overt racism takes the most obvious and odious forms of denigration. Racist jokes, stereotypes, belittling language, blackface, etc. Most people know it is not okay to engage in these types of behaviors, and yet inevitably around Halloween there will be a fraternity somewhere happily doing blackface, right? Because I guess some people just haven't figured this out. Right? Some still do, obviously, and those are the people that allow the rest of us to point and say, well, that's wrong, and at the same time to say, and I'm not like them, so I'm not a racist. Right? And that's where we're going to kind of have to move in toward something like a racialized consciousness, because it is in fact not true that just because you don't say racial slurs that you're not a racist. But it's a different kind of racism, and one we're often less sensitive to. The more malignant type of racism is covert racism. Many people are more familiar with institutional or systemic racism as signifiers for this type of racism. It's much harder to identify, and even harder still to overcome in the day-to-day life of an individual. Covert racism generally is part of the cultural fabric. Covert racism operates at a different level, though some forms are more obvious than others. Segregation and racial profiling being the easiest examples to kind of identify. Less obvious examples are coded in advertisements, government policies, individual actions that you don't immediately reconcile with racism. For instance, wondering if someone is here legally is actually a subtle form of racism, right? Questioning the legality of someone's presence, right? Someone of a particular race. Disdain directed at bilingual inclusion. So people who are like, English should be the language, right? That's totally racist. You probably get that. But then people who say things, and you probably have family members that do this, right? I do, unfortunately. Who like make a phone call and it's like, press 1 for Spanish or 2 for English. And they're like, why do I have to press 2 for English? Because you're a racist, right? And you won't learn to speak Spanish. Like, I don't know, right? Like these are sort of the kinds of ways that we reinforce covert racism. And we don't think of them as racist. We just think of them as sort of inconveniences. We have different ways of talking about this type of racism. Okay? Broad stroke dismissals of cultural practices unique to a group identity, like dismissing hip-hop and rap out of hand as just noise, or, that stuff's weird and I don't like it, right? I mean, some of it I don't like, but some of it you gotta like. I mean, Kendrick Lamar just won a Pulitzer Prize, and if you're not behind that, you're a racist, right? I don't know. Like, that's how that should work, right? But you don't have to like Kendrick Lamar to recognize that there's something valuable in his art, right? And the problem with broad stroke dismissals like that is that you often engage in covert racism without recognizing it as racism. Some people will actually talk about it as art criticism. That's weird to me, but people do it, right? Thinking rock and roll didn't originate in African American communities. That's racist, right? But we don't tend to think of it that way, and we don't tend to talk of it that way, right? We tend to think of Elvis Presley putting a sexy face on what African Americans were doing, and then it's rock and roll. All of a sudden it's cool and hip, and there's people falling over themselves to watch him swing his hips and like banning that shit from TV because it's like, oh my God, hypersexual, right? And we got a whole new discourse about rock and roll that allows us to ignore its roots in oppression, domination, and disenfranchisement, right? And that's part of covert racism. These are just a few of the more typical types of covert racism. Systemic racism is also about the disproportionate negative treatments of African American communities, where we might talk about over-policing, police brutality, higher rates of incarceration with longer sentences, gerrymandering of voting districts, poll taxes, literacy requirements to vote, prohibitively expensive college educations. In short, institutional levels of disenfranchisement, right? The level at which people who are in a cycle of poverty, who are perpetually disenfranchised, are incapable of accessing enfranchisement because of the way that society functions. This is covert institutional systemic racism. It's also a part of our environmental narrative, right? So when we talk about where we're gonna, or how we're gonna deal with environmental problems, we talk about environmental justice in broad strokes as if everybody's attempt at environmental justice looks the same. And it doesn't. Just like everyone's feminism doesn't look the same. And there's a reason, right? There's a reason we need to talk about this. Okay, so the real question, let me back up. So like it or not, we all participate in these types of racism. I believe that's true. I believe it's uncomfortably true for most people, right? This is a hard conversation to have. You don't bring this up at Thanksgiving, right? When crazy Uncle Frank is doing racist things in the kitchen, you're just like quietly like, pass the rolls, please, because you don't want to deal with it. That too is an act of racism, right? It's disengagement that allows racist attitudes to be vocalized or perpetuated, and it creates the conditions for the perpetuation of racism generally. If crazy Uncle Frank will do it in the kitchen, crazy Uncle Frank will do it at the grocery store, right? You got to check that behavior, but too often we don't want to because it's really uncomfortable when it's somebody you know, especially somebody you're supposed to have like familial love for. Okay, so the real question before us today is whether or not racism is at work in minority communities, and if so, how that racism perpetuates racial bias in this country. First, it's important to understand how covert racism, not overt racism, is the new white supremacy. I imagine that many of you here think of white supremacy as the domain of the Ku Klux Klan and swastika armband wearing neo-Nazis. But that's just traditional overt white supremacy, right? That was white supremacy when it was cool to be a white supremacist, right? That's turn of the century Jim Crow white supremacy. We know better now, right? And most of you are happily not Nazis and Klansmen, I'm guessing, right? I don't know you all personally, so somebody's like, ooh, keep that to yourself, right? Like, I don't know if you want to bring that up here. I mean, maybe you do. I can help you, right? So if you're secretly like, maybe I should get rid of the hood, stick around afterwards, right? I'll help you. That's what I do, right? So this is the stuff decent people avoid on purpose, right? I just think that's generally true, okay? New white supremacy is more troubling because it operates behind the scenes of our thought processes. What must be understood is that white supremacy has very little to do with your individual actions, but it cannot be adequately addressed until we are able to recognize it at work in our individual actions situated in the cultural and socio-political institutions that govern and shape our lives. In this usage of white supremacy, I mean something very particular. I mean the systems of racism that have been deployed so long as means and methods of domination that the white person today unsympathetically fails to acknowledge the root and source of their successes and benefits when those things are not exclusively and uncontroversially linked to overt racism, right? So when we talk about things like affirmative action, right? People complain that affirmative action disproportionately favors minorities because getting into college should be, anonymous and fair and the best students should get in. That sort of argument ignores that minority communities tend to house, their schools tend to be worse off. They're less well funded. They have less access to technology. They have fewer teachers. They have fewer good teachers. They have some of them don't even have school lunches or programs after school. So those individuals are at greater risk for not being able to make it into college on a fair and balanced sort of anonymous approach, which is why affirmative action exists, and that to enable those who can excel to break the cycle of poverty, right? And so when we argue against affirmative action, even though it seems like we're arguing for fairness, we're arguing for racism, right? But we don't think of it that way. This is what, and you can do this with pretty much anything when you talk about justice, because we don't have a really good conception of covert racism at work in our lives, okay? White supremacy of this type is not the Klan or the Nazis. It's not police brutality or mass incarceration. Rather, it is the cultural norms that seek to defend the KKK and Nazis as having freedom of speech so long as it doesn't cross the line into hate speech. Unfortunately, this is a relevant example today. The example you're looking for here is Donald Trump saying in the aftermath of Charlottesville that there are good people on both sides of the issue. You may not know this, but there's no such thing as a good person Nazi. Right? There is no good person Klansman. Like, I don't care once you put on the hood, good person's out of the question, right? There's a problem here. But for the president to advance the idea that there's a difference of ideas and there are good people on both sides is covert racism, right? Because he's not saying that Klansmen are good, because he's saying everybody on that side of the argument wasn't a Klansman. Some of them are just good people who are misunderstood. I got questions, right? You should have questions. I wouldn't ask them of Donald Trump. You're not going to get an intelligible answer. But, right, police brutality, similarly, we often join in the chorus of voices that denounce illegitimate police shootings. There have been a couple recently, right? The gentleman in his backyard on his cell phone, and the gentleman leaving Walmart that was shot 30 times just a few days ago in California. Right? And these are the most recent examples, right? So you can kind of get behind like that's wrong. Right? The police shouldn't be shooting people in parking lots or backyards. And so we can say that's wrong while simultaneously ignoring the racial profiling that goes unreported, because we have a whole narrative of security that allows us to make blanket statements about terrorists or Muslims, right? Brown-skinned people from the Middle East are obviously coming here to blow you up. And so what has happened as a result of our inability to address our racism is that you have a whole bunch of people that are brown-skinned that have been identified as terrorists even though they're not really Muslims. Right? They just get lumped in together and then targeted as a group. And so we, white folks, are like, police are shooting people and that's wrong. But then we think that gets us off the hook for when the police racial profile because, well, we got to be safe from terrorists, right? There's a problem, and the problem is racism, right? In both cases, embedded in the police department, which is built around an old narrative of policing that targets minority communities, right? Especially in this country, specifically African Americans, right? So there's a cultural narrative surrounding mass incarcerations that reiterates that black men are more likely to be violent, commit more crimes, act outside of the law in gangs, etc., while simultaneously failing or refusing to acknowledge that many of these superficially true things are the result of systemic poverty achieved through particular white domination, right? And so when we don't address the roots of poverty, you have these problems. These same problems exist in poor white communities. I don't need to deny that for it to be true. The problem is if you take a poor white person and let them commit a crime, and a poor black person have them commit the same crime, the black person is going to go to jail for twice as long, right? That's a problem. And yet we still use this narrative of their, inherited from people like Hillary Clinton, right? Super predator, that kind of stuff. And I don't really care how she intended it to be used or how it's been misused. Once you use that language, you're setting up the facade for covert racism, right? This idea. And I'll just give you an example real quick. I don't know if you all saw this or not. So there's a guy, I know this because he was in Kentucky. There's a guy in Louisville, Kentucky, who had a white guy. He had a gun, and he was shooting at police. And they said, put the gun down. He said no, and shot at him again. They said, we're not kidding this time, put the gun down. He said no, and shot at them again, 3 times. Then he put the gun down, and they rushed at him, and they arrested him. What? You take that scenario and put that in, say, the Bronx, we got a dead person after the first put the gun down.